Okay, so it's sensible with Betty Aldworth. Betty, thank you so much for doing this.
Seth, I'm so delighted to talk to you today.
So we have been talking and forgetting to record our conversations. So that's nice for us. And so here's one for the rest of the folks. And you and I were just talking and realizing that we are kind of approaching Cannabis 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we're defining that is Cannabis 0.0 was kind of pre-legalization. And so that you can do like a BC or a BCE or whatever.
Yes.
Cannabis 1.0 was legalization, and we are still definitely going through that. But we have there's no defining line. There's some overlap. One of
Mm-hmm.
the indicators of Cannabis 2.0 is someone like advocate activist Betty Aldworth from SSDP joining the corporate board of Forefront. Now, don't tell anybody that Chris Crane is involved here, but this is a multi-state operator. One of the phrases that we never had before. This is a big business, and they are calling on you to be on their board. Now, immediately, this makes me think, well, this is a different thing than industries usually do. I'm not sure that there are advocate activists that are on other boards.
Right. It's actually really interesting, and I think that it highlights something that we miss about cannabis very frequently, which is that the cannabis ecosystem, and particularly cannabis industry, is under so much pressure to be a socially responsible industry that I think that we're actually building new models that other industries can adopt, right? I think that we might be doing, in some ways, better than others. And I'm never going to say that it's good enough. It's not, but like we are, as a whole, creating a system where we're demanding that companies are thinking about their impact on the world around them. And I really love that a company like Forefront that has always, stood with us in support of doing things right, and really thinks very deeply about the long-term impact, social, economic, environmental, and otherwise, of their business decisions, is thinking also about how they, cement that into their leadership, right? I mean, listen, Chris was executive director of SSDP before he was a consultant with CanB and then before Forefront. But there is an ethos throughout that company of doing business well. And that's demonstrated over and over and over again. I'm really excited about some of the new projects that are coming online in that area. But like the commitment that is made by putting someone like me on the board is a really big deal that can't be understated. And I do think that it leads us into that next space.
Yeah. So other indicators of Cannabis 2.0 would be the Safe Banking Act passing the House and the House so far. And I don't worry about the timeline on that, as I just went to DC and did a bunch of interviews. And so it feels like it's going to be that way for a while. However, that is standalone cannabis federal legislation that has passed at least one House. So that's
yes.
The social justice initiatives and the fact that that town, as far as cannabis, is completely focused on it. We as an industry seem to be overtly focused on it in a different way than any other industry, as you mentioned. And sustainability is something that we are all focused on. So we are starting to get to the fact that we're feeling a little bit different than other industries. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have big companies that are doing weird things. That doesn't mean that we don't have our own little hiccups, like the vaping crisis. Do you use the word crisis, by the way?
I almost never use the word crisis, actually. I feel like it fits into a reactionary sentiment that causes people to freak out instead of look at the facts. I think that it is a vaping concern. And for those people who have lost their lives, families of those folks, for the people who have experienced these illnesses, I know that for them it's a crisis. Absolutely. and we don't fix the problem by socially and politically and governmentally by becoming reactionary about it. We fix the problem by looking with cool, clear heads at what the real data is. And so anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it, because for some, this is absolutely a crisis, but for others, this can't be a crisis because we have to, act with a cool head. And so, you're obviously the perfect person to talk to. Banning cannabis product about, right? Or I'm sure that sentence was not correct, but we have at least one governor that has banned vaping product, and that's reactionary, as you're mentioning, and it makes no sense if you are trying to sensibly regulate an industry for safe patient access to then prohibit it and bring us back to prohibition. You have the opportunity to regulate it. The opposite is to prohibit it. So, if I'm the governor of state X and I call up Betty and I say, okay, I see what we've done in at least one state. I can see how folks are saying that might not be the best way to go about it, but if I do have deaths in my state, I need to do something immediately, and I need to do something vociferously.
Yes.
What would your advice be to an executive?
Well, I think that, and forgive me, I haven't been in touch with the news this week as I would have liked. I've been super swamped on some pieces of internal work. But if I remember correctly, it's Colorado actually that has started to look at the additives. My sense is that we are going to find that some combination of additives and hardware is creating a reaction in the substance itself. And, I think that that's what, or something, but there is a contaminant somewhere along the lines. And the way that we solve contaminant problems in supply chains is by tracing it back through a regulated system where people have to document where they're getting things from, right? And listen, we can talk about the fentanyl crisis in exactly the same way. And that is a crisis. We can definitely identify that is a crisis that we are not dealing with at all. But the notion that by prohibiting a product that is regulated that people like and enjoy and have become accustomed to using is an answer is absolutely absurd. And so what we see is states like, I think, Colorado, prohibiting vitamin E acetate and PEG and things like this in the cartridges themselves. And that is an answer that makes sense, because those things are things that don't belong there anyhow. We can make a good, clean, pure product without any of that, but that is not in the interest of people who are operating in, outside of that regulated market. Listen, we've been saying for a decade, this was part of this I have been saying for a decade, and many people before me said before that the way that we fix these supply chain problems is through regulation, and we know it. When there's a problem with melons or lettuce, we know where to go to look for that. We can fix it, and we can make sure that people stay safe. We halt these emergencies much more quickly. We need to be able to do the same thing with cannabis, and the only way to do that is through widespread regulated markets.
There you go. And it's great that you bring up lettuce, which is a plant, because we are talking about the plant of cannabis. It is not dangerous. What you do to it might be dangerous. And so if you put vitamin E acetate in my lungs, maybe that's not where it belongs. But why did you put vitamin E acetate in the vape to begin with? It was to cut the product to put something else in. And so there you start to unwind what the actual problem is, as opposed to just pushing it.
Right.
Very quickly, there is now bills that are starting to crop up as far as flavored e-cigarettes, and folks are starting to, it sounds like, add menthol cigarettes to that list. And I've already spoken with Neil Franklin about how that obviously is not an appropriate thing to do, because what you're doing is you are singling out the consumer of a menthol cigarette, which is you can identify.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that, or am I out in left field here?
No, I'm.
A menthol cigarette is not a flavored e-cigarette, and so
A menthol cigarette is absolutely not a flavored e-cigarette. And also, there are so many different ways of looking at this, and anybody could go back to any number of podcasts and hear me say that my job would be much easier if we had never invented gummies. Like, people enjoy gummies. I don't think that we ought to prohibit them, but the fact of the matter is that optically they aren't helpful. And so, if we didn't have to deal with the question of gummies, our jobs at legalizing would be easier. And I think the same is true for things like, fruit flavored cannabis vapes, and the fact that some adults enjoy a fruit flavored e-cigarette or an otherwise mint flavored e-cigarette or a menthol cigarette ought not mean that, and that some people are afraid that kids are going to use them more frequently, ought not mean that we disallow the adults from using them. It's as absurd as saying that because some kids drink alcohol, we should not let adults drink alcohol. It's completely ridiculous. And the way to fix it is not through those bans, it's through creating positive education and regulatory models. I will never forget the walking through the BART stations in San Francisco and seeing these ads of like happy, young, good-looking young people having social good times. And it looked like an ad for a vape, but it was a public health ad saying, anti-vaping public health ad. How about we start getting our public health messaging right instead of suggesting to kids that it's a great time to use vapes and they're going to be prettier. Let's make sure that we're actually educating people about the real concerns and real harms and risks and not accidentally glamorizing. It's just mind-boggling some of the choices that people make here sometimes.
So, and that is exactly it. It's probably where we can end in that this is a public health issue. This is not a criminal issue. If you prohibit it, you make it a criminal issue. You don't solve anything. You don't learn anything.
Yep. And in Cannabis 3.0, we're going to start doing a better job of this overall, I think.
That's it. Well, we have to wholly get into Cannabis 2.0. Mm-hmm. Early indicator is Betty Aldworth herself, which is always an early indicator of where we should be going. And with that, I'll say thank you so much this time. I can't wait for the next time.
Can't wait for the next. Thanks so much, Seth.